Hello, I'm Sherry Goodman, Director of Education at the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm happy to welcome you to a conversation between two differently and similarly wonderful UC Berkeley geographers, Richard Walker and Seth Lunine. Their discussion complements the museum's Cal Conversations exhibition titled Lands of Promise and Peril, California Geographies. Lands of Promise and Peril grew out of Lunine's undergraduate geography course, whose students organized the show together with Associate Curator Stephanie Cannizzo. The two geographers will be discussing several timely issues that emerged from the exhibition with a few key images as touchstones. Richard Walker is Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Geography at Berkeley, where he taught for almost 40 years. He's the author of many articles and several notable books on California, including A History of Agribusiness, A Social Atlas, A History of Conservation Movements, and most recently, Pictures of a Gone City, Tech and the Dark Side of Prosperity in the San Francisco Bay Area. Seth Lunine received his doctorate in geography at Berkeley, where he studied with Walker and where he currently teaches. He's a human geographer with broad interests in urban cultures and economies in California and in the American West. Seth was recently a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow and is currently a Chancellor's Public Scholar. Seth is also active in Berkeley's American Cultures Engaged Scholarship Program. He'll now frame the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you, Dick, for being here today. As Sherry said, my name's Seth Lunine. I'm a lecturer in the geography department, and the course that this exhibit was associated with is Geography 50 AC California, and it's an American cultures course, which means that the course deals directly with issues related to race and ethnicity and culture, which is inescapable in California. And I think the best way to describe the course is to get into the conversation itself. But before we do that, I want to quickly mention and foreground the role of the students in this exhibition. 12 students from the course curated it. They selected images from the museum collections. They organized the exhibition with some broad themes, themes like nature and economy and cities and people. And within those themes, they created pairs and juxtaposed artworks in very interesting ways to try and tease out and discuss many of the contradictions inherent in California's development and of course contemporary California as well. One of their main tasks was writing extended labels or mini essays, and those were their interpretation and analysis of the artworks, of the relationships between the artworks and the like. And finally, it wasn't an afterthought, but it was a later addition to the exhibition. The students each selected a piece of art and wrote a personal reflection. And that reflection touched on their experience with the themes or issues represented by the artwork, and also commented on the contemporary significance of some of these themes. So what I'd like to do today, following the students' lead to some extent, is look at a couple pieces of art, contextualize it a bit more broadly, and then where possible, discuss continuity and discuss the contemporary significance of some of these themes.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I wanted to say how brilliant I thought the exhibit was, as not participating in it originally. I thought the students did a wonderful job, and obviously did a good job in guiding them. And I also wanted to say something about California 50 AC, this American Cultures course, because I'm the one who signed it up as an American Cultures course when this was a great experiment at the university over 30 years ago. And it's really interesting to see how times have changed. That at that time, it was rather controversial to think that there should be courses in every department and a requirement that the students take an AC course, meaning that they had to deal with race and ethnicity and the diversity of American life, American culture. And this, came as a shock to a lot of old professors. But it was wonderful for this course because it forced me to rethink the course entirely, to learn about race theory at that time, which was bubbling. And also what's interesting is how much the campus has changed in the interim. And when I look at the kids who did this, sorry, students, if I call you kids, I'm old now. The students who did this and how diverse they are compared to who we had in geography and that course on California back then. So I think the program has been wonderful. And I think what you've done with this exhibit has been terrific.
Well, thank you so much. And I also wanted to say that I've taught the course for about 5 years. And how long did you teach it, Dick?
25 years.
So I want to thank you specifically for, I guess, 2 things. One is the presence of the course in the department and the university as well. And also the fact that I rely on your scholarship to quite a great degree to structure the course and for reading assignments and the like. So I think that needs to be made clear as we move forward. I also meant to thank Stephanie Cannizzo, as well as Sherry and Lynn and other folks, but Stephanie really, this exhibition wouldn't have been possible without her. She was an incredible mentor and friend and really an educator as well. So, so I want to, again, thank her publicly because she was absolutely integral to this project, which was incredibly interesting, a bit harried and quite a bit of learning by doing as we moved forward. So let's see, this is Elvina. It's called Slate Bluff Mining Company. It's from 1869. And myself and a couple of students really grew to appreciate this particular image. It captures mining at a sort of a transitional stage. Certainly you can see the increased scale, the increased mechanization, the shift from the independent miner, who was often romanticized and glorified, but the shift from the independent miner to wage labor. The issues around corporate ownership. On the lower right-hand corner, there's the list of owners of the mine itself. The students also honed in on representations of non-white people in this image. There's Chinese laborers, if you look closely, working in the mine itself, but also in the foreground, there's depictions of Chinese immigrants in terms of otherness, in terms of difference, with an opium pipe, with the cues. And there's also native Californians symbolized with bows and arrows and baskets and bare chests and the like, and issues of productivity, issues of exclusion, and a lot of work in terms of defining race through representation, right? But the image itself and this scaling up of mining overall, we're on the sort of eve of hydraulic mining and an even larger scale of investment, innovation, and of course, environmental degradation, right? But Dick, I'm wondering, we foreground in the course extraction and mining of a number of different resources is integral to California's economic development over time. And how would you approach or state the importance of this activity, you know, certainly beginning with statehood itself?
Yeah, California is such an industrial and urban state today, leading the world in things like entertainment, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley technology, that it's easy to forget that California was built on mining. The economy started with mining in the 1848, 1849 with the gold rush, and very quickly transformed into a modern, what we'd call a capitalist, modern market economy with Anglos, but people from around the world streaming in to participate in the gold rush and then beyond. And pretty quickly, after the first 5 years of the gold rush, which is what's romanticized, it becomes an industry. Mining becomes a giant industry, gold mining, silver mining, mercury mining, and more. And mining the forest for the timber to build those sluices that you see, sluices and woodwork supporting the mines and so on. They stripped the forests of Tahoe, for example, to go into the Comstock Lode just over the border in Nevada. And at that time, Nevada was essentially part of California. So that's how California was built. It was a resource economy, overwhelmingly for the first 100 years, that plundered the earth, the fair earth of this state, in order to extract value, to extract precious metals, and to make profit. And it took a lot of investment to do that. So this was a serious economy that recycled the surplus from the mines back into more mines, deeper mines, more timber, farther away, exploration, and so on. And it actually revolutionized the technology of mining, which had been fairly constant since about the 15th century in Europe. And California industrialized mining for the first time with huge machines like stamp mills, long distance water pipes made in Union Iron Works and other foundries in San Francisco, Oakland, and the South Bay. So this is quite a heroic, dramatic, but also horrific history.
Yes, and certainly we see a lot of important connections between the different resource frontiers and the cities, primarily in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and to some extent Oakland and the East Bay, in terms of not only finance and control and ownership of these mines at an ever-increasing scale, as you said, and not only in terms of the flow of labor, but also knowledge, and also in particular, the industrial development in the Bay region, in San Francisco in particular, of incredibly innovative cutting-edge industries. Like you said, mining machinery in particular, certainly chemicals and high explosives. The Bay Area certainly led the nation, and for a moment, perhaps much of the West in terms of output. And this was a novel industry. These were new things developed in tension with different mining enterprises, and it enabled an ever increasing, as you say, amount of plunder and extraction from the earth itself, as well as just horrific environmental degradation. And I know you've done incredible work around not only mining, but also environmentalism and conservation in California. And where do we locate in time or in space that incipient movement of environmentalism, if we can term it as such?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would riff off two of things that you just said. One is that today we tend to think of technology, high tech, as electronics, as information technology, as the phone in your hand. But in these days that we're talking about, mining was one of the highest tech operations in the world, and it propelled not only industry and industrial equipment and so on, but also science, the science of exploration, the science of understanding deep geology, first with gold and later with other metals and finally with petroleum in the late 19th, early 20th century. So it connects to today in that way. And the other way it connects to today is your second theme, Seth, which is environmentalism. California led the world pretty much in the conservation movement for a century. When it started in the late 19th century or mid to late 19th century as a reaction to mining, because mining had so despoiled parts of the Sierra Nevada, parts of the coast ranges, and the rivers that flowed out carrying massive amounts of debris from hydraulic and mining, from dredging of the rivers to try to find gold in the rivers, And basically, the mining era turned the landscape of California upside down.
Mm.
And that's led to a huge reaction of people living in the Bay Area, because LA was pretty small at that time, and ultimately around the country, drawing somebody like John Muir in the late 19th century after he had heard about California. California had this golden reputation of opportunity, but also of this amazing natural endowment of whether it's the biota or the mountains or the deserts and the ocean and so forth. But it's because mining turned it upside down, starting in the mid-19th century, that we got this intellectual reaction saying, my God, this has gone too far. We really need to rethink what we're doing. We need to limit it. And indeed, within 25 years, there was a major court case that stopped hydraulic mining, which was flooding the rivers of the Sacramento Valley with debris and leading to massive flooding. Unfortunately, to connect to today, what they never did was to stop the use of mercury,
right,
which was essential to gold and silver mining, to the smelting of gold and silver. And that mercury is still around to plague us. And it's one of the reasons why you don't want to eat tuna caught off the California coast very often. And you don't want to eat fish out of San Francisco Bay very often, because the mercury is still down there in the bottom sediments of the bay, in the ocean, and it gets recycled through the fish and the wildlife. And some of it comes back to haunt us through the food chain.
Yeah, and that's a crucial connection, I believe, for a lot of students to link it to the contemporary scene in their own lives as well. And the other thing, or one other thing you mentioned, saw your decision that to some extent outlawed hydraulic mining. And I know it's often hailed as an environmental victory, which it was to some extent. And at the same time, as you've written about in Gray Brecken as well, the decision was based on the protection of private property, right? And also on behalf of a lot of agricultural interest in the state. So perhaps we could move to the next slide. It's jumping around chronologically a bit, but certainly we could consider California agribusiness as another type of extraction, as another way to extract profit from the land. And this is a photo by Perkle Jones. It's called Grape Picker Berryessa Valley. It was printed, or it was taken in 1956 during the Bracero program, but it was printed in 1968. And one student, Mohini Rai, did quite a bit of research around this and found that this particular image was crucial, or an element of the Delano grape strike. And the students commented on how the agricultural worker is depicted, looking up, forthright, perhaps proud, certainly not as anonymous as some of the previous photos of agricultural workers as well. So this is one particular moment, but it of course relates to incredible succession of immigration, of recruiting workers, of hiring and exploiting them, and then essentially disposing of them, especially if they are organizing. But where do we place agriculture historically and certainly today in terms of California's development and economic might? In addition to, of course, patterns of immigration, it's a clear example how immigration was and continues to be the lifeblood of California, right? And it is also a key arena in which much of California's diversity was enhanced over time.
Absolutely. And I think it does follow up nicely on the theme of exploitation of the land and of nature, because agriculture took over from mining by the 1880s to become California's biggest industry right through about World War II. So, and it is still huge. Again, people sometimes forget how important it still is. Yet certain figures will be put up to argue that, you know, it doesn't really dominate the way it used to. But in fact, if you look at the combination of crops and processing and things like wine, in this case with a grape picker, the overall impact of agribusiness on the state is upwards of 5 to 10% of the state's income, state's output. So that's a really significant amount. And the way it worked is, of course, to exploit the land. And we geographers can't say often enough how agribusiness actually transformed the landscape. That is, they flattened parts of the Central Valley, which we think of as flat, but they made it even flatter. They moved water around from north to south, from east to west, in huge amounts to make this enterprise work. They laid on fertilizer, soil amendments, and pesticides. California was the most pesticided place on earth in the middle of the 20th century. And ironically, it was the farm workers who were instrumental in fighting back against DDT and bringing the DDT era to an end. We tend to think of it as all, you know, white environmentalists and Rachel Carson, but the farm labor and the farm workers union were instrumental in that battle. Now, the second point you brought up, Seth, was about the workers. So we have a chance here to talk about something we didn't talk about with mining, because it's even more clear, which is that industry and capital are always exploiting the land and labor together. And in the case of agriculture, the amount of labor is enormous. In mining, there are a lot of people down in that picture of the mine, down in the mine. And some of them were Chinese. Many of them were, of course, European immigrants, but they were immigrants. And they were heavily exploited. But in agriculture, as you said, it's been a sequence of immigrant groups brought in at the lowest level, treated as unskilled, even though there's a lot of skill to working fast in picking, in trimming, and so on, taking care of the field. And they've been brought in with the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, even Sikhs from India, Mexicans, of course, and then today you have Guatemalans, you have a lot of Mixtecans, Zapotecans from southern Mexico, and so on. Many of them, you know, they're undocumented workers who are the most exploited. And agriculture in California has been this ironic combination of the most advanced agriculture in the world during the century between 1875 and 3/4 century, 1875 to the Second World War. And at the same time, some of the worst exploitation of labor, cheap labor, grueling hours, and as you said, when people are finished with a harvest or they can't work for injury or sickness, they're basically thrown on the scrap heap and you move on to other workers. And this has happened over and over. And it still happens, of course, in modern industry, construction. Immigrants are essential to this economy. They're the most exploited. And it's representative of California's leading role in the kind of immigrant America that is so much in our minds today, with the battles over immigration policy and over racism in America and the racial order.
Absolutely, and I think it's pivotal for the students to understand how, exactly as you said, in this incredibly dynamic industry over time, how cheap human labor is integral to profitability. And the other thing, it's an important way in which to understand, again, speaking on some of my intentions and the class itself, for students to see how cultural domination or racism and economic exploitation are intricately woven together in different ways over time in California, in the Central Valley in particular.
Yeah, I think this point about economic exploitation, what is often called class, and racial ordering and racism is often treated as two separate things. And there's some reasons why that has occurred in American history and why people think that way. But in California, it's absolutely seamless, precisely because of this process we talked about. California has always been an immigrant state. Even when we think about the gold rush, people were immigrants into California for the gold rush, and they came from around the world. Yes, there were a lot of Yankees, but there were Southerners, Midwesterners, and there were a large number of Chinese. Maybe 10% of the so-called Argonauts were Chinese, Sonorans from Mexico, Chileans, Australians, who were mostly Irish. And so from the very beginning, California has been an immigrant state. There wasn't a decade until the year 2000, between 1850 and 2000, in which more people didn't immigrate into California and then were born here. And that has been essential to our character, our cultural character, why California is so different than other parts of the United States, many other parts of the United States. It's been white dominated, but it's also been much more of a melange of people and much more of a place where mingling and cultural contact and cultural learning has taken place. So some of the positive elements of California, when we denounce the racism, which of course we have to, and the exploitation, some of the positive sides of California diversity were evident even in the 19th century and have continued to develop to today, when we now have a majority minority or a majority people of color state. And Californians have had several very nasty moments along the way of panic about immigration, panic over race, which is very much worth talking about because the US is going through exactly that kind of a moment now. But Californians have also, again and again, done remarkably well at overcoming that. And I think we see the results of that today. So, I want to strike the upbeat note because we strike many downbeat notes in this discourse.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I'm certainly prone to that, not highlighting enough the beneficial and positive outcomes of this hybridity, arguably. And I think, as you say, the parallels are just, the parallels, the repetitions, they're just eerie today in many ways. Things like the Working Men's Party of California and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and looking at sort of the ideology of that group. What do we mean by fascism? How is it animated? And anti-immigrant sentiment today. There's certainly one fascinating element of this course and of these historical geographies is the parallelism, is the contemporary meaning and reiterations to some extent of these really dreadful historical moments. But indeed, when you're talking about the mix of people, the immigration of brains to California and new techniques to adapt, certainly there's parallels with Silicon Valley today in terms of a global, both a global pool of skilled labor who's attracted, and also the more invisible subordinate service sector as well. So a lot of different complements and parallels, of course.
And it's interesting in agriculture, and often overlooked, how much technical innovation there was. California agribusiness has been unbelievably innovative. But when we talk about agribusiness and exploitation of labor and race, it's easy to overlook that these immigrants contributed quite a bit to the development of agribusiness, not just from the sweat of their brow, but from the ingenuity of their minds. So that Chinese helped plant the first orchards, and fruit became the biggest agricultural product in the late 19th century, replacing wheat. And the Chinese played a very important role in that, and a skilled role. And then the Japanese came in around the turn of the century, and they brought in things like strawberries and rice. And through the beginning of the 20th century and up through the 1930s, the Japanese contributed enormously to those kind of specialty crops, which are some of your highest value and some of the most characteristic of California. And the same thing goes on today with the introduction of immigrant crops like bok choy and so forth that have been planted both because people knew how to grow them who were not white American, and because of the market created by a large pool of immigrants here that would support specialty crops. So the character of California agribusiness, which overshadows any other part of agriculture in America in its diversity of crops, its diversity of land uses, its technological development, and of course, in its array of people. And in bringing in that array of people, as did industry as well, we created a kind of racial order in California that, while draconian at times, without question, is very different than the East. And so when we talk about slavery in the East, that was very little or non-existent in California, barely existent, but we have a very different racial order. And it's often Californians are talking, and people from the East Coast are talking by each other, right past each other, when they talk about what counts in American racial history.
No, I think that's an absolutely essential point. In addition to your others, that we're not dealing with this black-white binary like a lot of studies of race emanating from the East, and certainly slavery. We're dealing with this complex hierarchy, both in terms of status and class, and also race, that emerges over time in California. Initially considering Latinx people, Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and then a broader circle drawn around whiteness than in other parts of the country, perhaps. But it is distinct to California, and I think it plays directly into your points on diversity over time in the state. Thank you. So another jump in time and in topic, but we're also dealing with the use of the land, the extraction of value from the land, the commodification and speculation in property. And this is an image by David Maisel. It's called Oblivion 7N, and it's from 2004. Okay, and before I move forward, I want to point out that this is an incredibly fascinating and intricate work conceptually, and we're at the moment sort of using it as a stand-in or a marker for suburban sprawl, metropolitan development, but I would definitely suggest and invite anyone who's interested to go to David Maisel's website and read his explanation of this work. But we're jumping thematically to issues, again, of property development and commodification of the land itself, but in the metropolitan context, and initially suburbanization. And I think students often, they take suburbia for granted. It gets a little bit blurry, it gets a little bit fuzzy. Where does it stop? Where does it begin? Are we dealing with a particular type of landform? Are we dealing with municipal boundaries or incorporated municipalities or something like that? And in class, we look at the diversity of suburbs and processes of metropolitan development over time, beginning with those affluent suburbs that we think of most typically early on in terms of the redoubts of the very wealthy, certainly the middle class and streetcar suburbs, and something I'm particularly interested in, industrial suburbs as well, right? But certainly the post-war period, we saw the massive increase in the area of suburban land in California and prodigious federal government investment, right? So looking at this post-war period where most people mistakenly believe that the suburbs really came into being, but what is the role of suburbanization, you know, in the development of our cities, and certainly speaking of race, in the racial segregation of metropolitan areas? That's a key theme in course, a key theme in the course over time, but particularly in this post-war era, and particularly considering the role of the federal government in effect, institutionalizing or codifying racial segregation.
Well, California's history of urbanization is really interesting, Seth. And we tend to immediately jump to the post-war and this picture here of coastal LA or Orange County. I'm not quite sure where it is, and that's the point. But California was a very urbanized state from the beginning. The combination of mining fortunes, mining surplus, feeding into San Francisco, made it possible for that San Francisco to become a big financial, commercial, and industrial center already in the middle of the late 19th century. And Californians tended not to be settlers of the land in the way we think of Illinois, Iowa, or Pennsylvania. And when we look at agriculture, it's the same thing. Agriculture in California turned very quickly into capitalist business agriculture with very large land holdings, a lot of wage labor, and not that many farms. I mean, California had maybe 10% of most of the farms in a state like Iowa, even though we're much bigger and our output was much higher. Okay, that means that, again, the surplus was flowing through cities. A lot of the work on agricultural processing was being done in the cities. Agricultural equipment was being done in the cities, towns and cities around the state. And it was a very urban state long before World War II. That means, of course, it also is a very suburban state. And we already saw this process in the Bay Area or LA of the city starting to move outward. And that's what we really mean by suburbanization. It's a slippery term, and geographers try to be careful about the many ways it can be used. Suburb just means outside the city. So it is this process of extending the city outward. It also means, of course, jurisdictions. And California has some of the most fragmented cities in the country, particularly the Bay Area, but also around LA and out in the Central Valley, where growing suburbs would draw lines around themselves and become their own cities. So San Francisco split off from San Mateo County, which then had its own array of cities. Alameda County, Oakland was the core, but very quickly, Berkeley was a suburb of Oakland and San Francisco, which then made itself a separate city, followed by Albany, El Cerrito, and so on. The most amazing ones are like Piedmont, which is actually in the middle of Oakland and is an elite suburb, or Emeryville, your favorite topic, which is industrial enclave, and so on. These are all over this state. And the state was a pioneer. California was really a pioneer in urbanization in America. And we tend to think of New York, Chicago as being the leading lights in the development of cities, of modern cities. And then, LA maybe later is kind of the big slurb. Well, California has this really powerful development of it has finance to create cities. It's prosperous, so a lot of people can buy homes. So it already has this tendency to sprawl out as a city of homes. It has big developers who love to move to the edge and spread out the city because that's where you make the most money. You buy farmland and then you flip it over to urban land, and that's where you make the real money, not in the building of houses, but in the land rents. And so California developed bigger developers, more sprawling cities, bigger roads, well, first bigger streetcar systems, and then bigger and longer highway systems to serve that whole complex of sprawling urbanization. And the Bay Area is very much the same as LA. We tend to think of it as more compact because of San Francisco and parts of Oakland and Berkeley. But if you look the overall Bay Area, which now reaches into the Central Valley, down far into the lower Santa Clara Valley, up beyond Santa Rosa, it's every bit the equal of LA in its sprawl and its segmentation, and finally in its segregation.
Absolutely, and I think you know, for students new to the study of cities and California cities in particular, it becomes incredibly difficult for them initially to see that sequential outward movement, those various rings, how the city, at least the urban fabric, spreads over time and envelops previous suburban nodes along the way. And I think one thing particular about the post-war moment is the role of the federal government. Of course, it started during the New Deal with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA, and providing credit and backing private lending institutions, right? But then these policies are expanded immensely to both builders and home buyers in the post-war period. But during this time, we see a new scale of metropolitan development and more hardened, rigid, perhaps, patterns of segregation. So one theme is considering whiteness, because in this discussion of race, it's important. And again, this is a lower division class, but to be very clear, when we talk about racial formations or race making, that whiteness isn't a static, fixed category or identity. It certainly changes, is contested, and transforms over time, right? But this moment, there is a key link, perhaps, between suburban home ownership and whiteness in terms of politics, in terms of identity, in terms of notions of upward mobility, right? And simultaneously, like we'll get to in a moment, incredible disinvestment in central cities accompanied with urban renewal, right? But in terms of suburban California, is it safe to say that this is a moment where we're talking about not necessarily new patterns and new modes of segregation, but an enhanced, spatially enhanced moment of entrenched metropolitan segregation?
Well, I think segregation is an area where California was very innovative too. It's important to remember that the history of segregation goes well back into the 19th century, just as does the history of suburbanization. So some of the first outward movement in San Francisco, for example, is suburbanization. It's movement to what's now called the Western Addition, which was block after block, miles of beautiful Victorian row houses for the white professional and middle classes, whereas the working class was south of Market, and the Chinese were hemmed in Chinatown. They were the big minority of that time, and they were really locked into Chinatown by the anti-Chinese movement of the 1870s and 80s, in which there was could be quite dangerous to venture outside of Chinatown. And what precedes the FHA, HOLC, and redlining, the post-war kind of framework of segregation, were two important things. One was racial covenants, where it's written into the deed that this house can never be sold to or used by a member of the Mongolian, the Negro, or other races. And it would usually include Jews as well. And these are still, you can find this language in deeds, housing deeds, much to the shock of new homeowners sometimes, even though they don't have any force of law anymore, but they're still on a lot of old deeds. And those came in the late 19th century. Then there was a thing called zoning, which is where you divide up the city by uses. And that was invented in the early 20th century. And was used to, first of all, to protect exclusive upper class districts that were being developed in considerable number at that time. Now, the first zoning law was actually an anti-Chinese laundry law. It was a use law. You couldn't have a Chinese laundry in white neighborhoods. And that goes back to the 1860s. And it was declared illegal. They tried to bring it back in the 20th century expressly as racial zoning. But that was thrown out by the Supreme Court. So they had to do it in other ways. And they did it with this use zoning where you just keep out, you would make very large lots, so only the rich could afford it. And you would keep out commerce and apartments and any sort of non-conforming uses so that the white people could, and the upper class people could enjoy their beautiful neighborhoods. Berkeley actually was one of the leaders, as was Los Angeles in around 1910. This was led by a Berkeley realtor, Mason McDuffie, still exists, and was very tied in with the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So racial segregation was going on around the country. It was being tested in the legal frameworks to try to harden it were being tested. San Francisco, if you look at Presidio Heights, that was one of the first exclusive, basically whites-only developments. And it's where Senator Dianne Feinstein lived for a long time. I believe she's moved from there, but it still exists. It's still an exclusive area near Pacific Heights. And then they started moving farther out. We forget, that Mill Valley or the Hillsborough were major elite suburbs of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Berkeley was a suburb and was basically for white professionals who could get on the trolley car and go to Oakland or all the way over on the ferry to San Francisco. There was working class Berkeley, but that was down at Ocean View in the west part of the city. And that was where, the not so good people, the workers, the Irish and the Scandinavians and so on were working in factories, and they were kept out of, university side of Berkeley up against the hills. And zoning really helped do that. But there are other ways it was done. It was done through real estate agents. The banks, weren't going to lend to what they regarded as bad risks. So when you get to the New Deal programs, which get a lot of blame for this, and in some ways rightly so, because they went along with this and they locked it in a way that gave the imprimatur and the legal backing of the federal government. But basically they were they were sort of raising the ante on what white people already wanted, white upper class people. And that carried over very strongly into the post-war era, when, interestingly enough, for the first time, large percentages of working class white people were able to buy houses because of FHA 30-year mortgages backed by the federal government. So suburbia was this huge field of opportunity now, not only for the upper classes, the upper 20%, for another, say, 25% of more skilled, unionized, better paid white workers. Whereas people of color and lower wage workers were left out of this because if they came into a neighborhood or in their neighborhoods, they were regarded as a bad risk. And you could do this in a very subtle way without actually saying it was based on race. You would say it was based on the chance that the property values, the house values might be undermined, and therefore the loans that were backed by the banks, that were backed by the federal government, might be made less, might not be paid off. So on that logic, you could say, well, we really aren't going to back mixed neighborhoods because maybe they won't pay off their loans. Now, of course, the whole thing's based on an unbelievable racial logic of white supremacy. But interestingly enough, and then I'll cut this off, but in the Civil Rights Act and the Housing Acts of 1968, redlining was made illegal again. And FHA rules were changed, and you couldn't do this anymore. You couldn't exclude Black people from getting federally guaranteed mortgages. But what happened after that? Did suburbia suddenly integrate? No. Some areas, parts of the Oakland Hills integrated, parts of Berkeley, central Berkeley integrated, and that's all to the good. But today, we are still massively segregated in the Bay Area, and it has really not gotten better. It has moved around. New kinds of people have come in, new immigrant groups, ethnic, racial categories. Neighborhoods have transformed dramatically. A lot of the Black ghetto, a lot of it is emptied out, and people have moved out to, Black people have moved out to Pittsburgh, Antioch, and all the way to Stockton, for example. And yet the segregation continues. So something else is going on besides mortgage practices and so on. There's so many angles, so many ways in which the white world can enforce consciously, a bit unconsciously, aggressively, or simply by passive agreement, the idea that certain people should be your neighbors because they're well behaved, they have nice incomes, they're like you, they talk like you, they think like you, they eat like you, and so on. And those subtle cultural rules, backed up by real estate agents and the whole market in housing, and also by local governments and zoning rules, end up leaving us just as segregated as we ever were.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. Absolutely, I think it's essential to understand the antecedent real estate practices that were codified by the FHA and Hulk as well. And this supremacist taken for granted notion that so-called inharmonious mixing was a detriment to property values, that non-white neighborhoods were essentially predetermined to lose their property values, and the like. And indeed, the federal government even recommended restrictive covenants in their underwriting manual, and the formal policies that were used by banks in order to make loans in the post-war period. And I also think it's essential for students in particular to understand different ways to consider white privilege in this instance. And it's amazing today that much of the intergenerational wealth, which is so disproportionately obtained by white families, was gained before 1964 in inherently exclusionary property markets. It's not simply the startup tech millionaires and the latest booms and busts, but a lot of the wealth and the assets held and passed along intergenerationally involve modest home ownership and how that appreciates over time. And I think the contemporary, what some people call, including yourself and Alex Schafrin, metropolitan resegregation or the suburbanization of poverty, that exactly like you said, we are seeing a spatial reshuffling of a lot of these dynamics. And I think it's particularly intense in the Bay Area, to LA to a lesser extent, places like Seattle and perhaps Boston, where there is the forced displacement disproportionately of non-white communities of color and working class folks who are priced out and through forced evictions and other modes who are increasingly living in these suburbs. You know, in the Bay Area today, cities on the Carquinez Strait like Vallejo and Antioch have some of the highest rates of diversity and highest rates of poverty at the same time. So I think right now we are seeing a sort of inversion of, you know, this previous spatial pattern based on race, based on class. And again, it's particularly intense in the Bay Area itself.
Well, it's ironic, you know, when this discourse, for example, of our dear president right now about, you know, cities are raging with violence and crime. It's his whole line of fear mongering, which is basically a 50-year-old notion that was used by Republican politicians in the 1970s and 80s to scare white people in the suburbs. And our notions need to be updated about how the city is organized. And geographers have been writing about this for some time now. But this idea of a black core and a racially dark core of the cities with white ring of suburbs is actually quite antiquated. It's obsolete now because so much of the population of color has moved out over the years, of the last 20 years, certainly maybe 30, has moved out to to former suburbs and reorganized the spatial alignment of races. Whereas young white people, like the techies in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, have moved in droves back to central cities. We see it in Oakland now with you know, an enormous influx of white tech people or more professional tech people, more upper class students and so on, moving in to what was a very black and minority city. So whereas the population of many people of color has moved out to places from Hercules to Antioch or down in Cupertino, Campbell, places that were formerly quite white suburbs. And this, you know, this inversion means we have to talk about something else, because what created a lot of this inversion is the impact. I don't want to dismiss tech, because the impact of tech industry and office-based industries, finance and management in the center, near the center of cities, has attracted an upper class professional and ownership, a business ownership class into the central cities, which has led to this massive revival of central cities and what we call gentrification, but is a much larger process than just neighborhood gentrification. It's a sort of reconquest of central cities that had been abandoned by upper class white people in the post-war era, creating the black ghettos and the minority inner city concentrations. And now they've come rushing back in because a lot of the best jobs are in inner cities, because that's the nature of employment in tech. A lot of it is right there. You have to be close, you have to work all the time. And the kind of culture that goes along with it, the rediscovery of urban culture and the abandonment of what had been sort of post-war family suburban culture that was so attractive to, say, my parents. So we have to rethink the cities as Americans have rethought the cities. And the other side of this attraction of the city is the blowout of the black ghettos and many Latinx neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, by the mortgage meltdown of 2007, 2008, that the subprime mortgage catastrophe, which was centered in California. California had more mortgages, more low of the marginal mortgages, huge balloon mortgages, alternate variable mortgages, and so on, than any place on earth. And so when the meltdown, the financial crisis happened in 2007-8, that created the Great Recession, it was centered on California. And this is partly because it had become so expensive, so prosperous, so wealthy, and so expensive, and then was bringing in millions of new immigrants and their children and paying them badly, much worse than, say, post-war white working class people have been paid. And they couldn't afford houses. So the only way they could get a house was to get a balloon mortgage, a subprime mortgage, and then those all blew up when the financial balloon, the financial bubble burst in 2007-8. And it left millions of Americans. It meant they lost their houses. California, more people lost houses in California than anywhere. And they were overwhelmingly families of color. And it's amazing, Oakland alone, which you don't think as a big Black homeowning city, and yet a lot of people did, 10,000 houses were foreclosed on basically overwhelmingly on people of color in Oakland. And those people then either had to become renters or they moved out to become renters in the suburbs. They just abandoned the inner city because they couldn't afford it anymore. So it's amazing the kind of churning of our cities, and yet, as segregation continues.
Yeah, and one other side point, I think the link between these historical patterns of disinvestment in central cities, thinking of property development and speculation, it just created the possibility for incredible speculative returns on the so-called gentrification of those areas. So it's just a very harsh link over time that the very conditions for contemporary profitability were enabled by a lack of access to credit, right? By a lack of access to loans. And often those are the types of spots, North and West Oakland, certainly the Mission in San Francisco, where we'll just refer to it as gentrification for the moment, but it first takes root. Largely because of the possibilities for speculative gains.
No, that's right. I mean, the massive white people benefited from the post-war house buying suburban boom, and whereas Blacks and other people of color did not. And then that left the conditions that were ripe in the inner city for people to be gentrified out, partly because they were not homeowners, they were renters. And so houses could be sold out underneath them. That's still going on as prices went up, partly because the federal government tried to right the old wrong by encouraging people of color to buy into houses when they really couldn't afford it. And when speculative finance could take advantage of their inability to really afford those increasingly expensive houses, that left them out on the financial gangplank from which they were eventually forced to jump. And then that opens up even more the inner city neighborhoods for white returnees to the city to buy up those properties. But all of this, it's very important to recognize, on the one hand, that the mass of white people who are complicit in white domination, the desire for segregation and not mixing, that's well documented when you interview white people over many decades now. Sociologists, geographers have done this, that they're always the most nervous about integration and want to keep people of color out, that they feel going to undermine their lovely neighborhoods. But the mass of white people bought into this, and And then again, a lot of them buy into the re-urbanization, tech workers who aren't the bosses of the tech firms. They're exploited, they work like crazy. And a lot of them are not as well paid as we're led to believe.
Yeah.
And yet they buy into the kind of myth of the new urbanity and all that. So that's important. But at every step, there is big capital, big business, big investors leading the way. So the big investors made big money, and the big lenders and the bankers made money on post-war suburbanization, both lending to it and investing in it, where you made money on this huge price gap out at the suburban fringe. And then when you reinvest in the city, you reconquer the city, you go into neighborhoods that have been undervalued or even blown out by the financial crisis. And then you can buy cheap again. And there are guys like our Treasury Secretary, National Treasury Secretary, Mnuchin was one of these guys who made his fortune buying up foreclosed houses around the country and then renting them back to the people who used to live there.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that kind of predatory work. There was a lot of financial speculators who blew up the whole subprime market. Some of those, the biggest operators were here in California, like Countrywide Saving, the biggest of all, was headquartered in Los Angeles. And so these guys went out going and coming and then coming back again. And we can't forget that. We focus on maybe the tech billionaires, which is important. Yeah. But the guys involved in land development and urban development are really big players, and somehow they get overlooked. Cities are thought to sort of just happen because, oh, that's what people want. But they are constructed just as much as your Apple iPhone was constructed by the vision of Steve Jobs. Your suburbs and your cities are constructed around the ideals of big developers like the Coal Company or Lennart Company, or before that, Bohannon and Eichler in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, and one way it's manifest is this just despicably shrinking percentage, in particular of African Americans, in places like San Francisco, where it was already disproportionately small, but especially in Oakland, it had led the nation for several years in terms of the percentage increase in rents and property prices. But the 50% decrease of African American residents of Oakland, over the course of 15 or 20 years, and the loss of, incredible economic, political, and of course cultural power in the city itself. But it might make sense now to loop back a bit and look at some of those central city areas to talk about, link it to perhaps some of the current moment in terms of fights for racial equality and Black Lives Matters and the like. And I would throw in one additional point just in terms of the patterns and how these processes are manifest. It seems like indeed the Bay region in this case, and LA as well, they are incredibly diverse as a metropolitan region, right? But we still see these more localized patterns of exclusivity and segregation that, as you say, although they're shifting, they are as striking and intense in many cases as before. Speaking of central cities, in this case, West Oakland, this is a photograph by Perkle Jones. It is entitled Black Panthers from Sacramento, Free Huey Rally, Bobby Hutton Memorial Park, Oakland, California, August 25th, 1968. So the students are fascinated by the Black Panther Party, right? Initially the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right? Because it's impossible to overstate the role of police violence in the formation of Black Panthers in particular, but of course, as we see, resistance today more generally. The students who wrote about this particular photo and some others were struck by their understanding of the role of women in the formation and the leadership of the Black Panther Party, and necessarily so with the criminalization of many male leaders and the assault upon them. You know, we're dealing with issues clearly of criminalization, right, which can't be separated again from what's going on today. Another element of the Black Panthers that the students, I think, is less known more generally is what they called practical revolutionary activity, and that is the programs that were free, that supported the community and that sought to fill the gaps that government failed in redressing issues of poverty and hunger and inadequate housing and the like. So switching back to our understanding of metropolitan development, I think it's crucial to locate the Black Panther Party, the emergence of Black power in this instance, of course not exclusively, in West Oakland, in this context of disinvestment in the central city, of urban renewal projects that literally destroyed massive swaths of housing and community itself, the lack of access to opportunity, and, you know, ongoing patterns of police violence, right? So again, these community programs that addressed everything from housing to education through the Liberation School, of course, the free breakfast program, services for seniors, medical services, dental services, ambulatory services. Kirby Lynch, who's a graduate student in geography currently and a GSI for the course, put together an amazing list of the Black Panther free programs that of course started in Oakland and the Bay region and rapidly expanded nationally and internationally. And another key point here is these are young people. These are young people in West Oakland, overlapping with Berkeley and the university to some extent, but this is youth energy, right? But in terms of considering this moment, I mean, I think the parallels are clear, but one, we're talking about conditions in the central city in which Black power in this context emerged. And another big question is, well, what are the connections and parallels we can draw between this moment, and it's not a seamless thread, right, or a straight line, but between this moment and what's going on today, particularly in terms of criminalization, and as we see today, the escalation of tensions and order for our leaders to create criminals and then crack down in the name of law and order and things like that. But what are some of the key patterns and parallels that you see connecting this moment of Black power with some contemporary issues that we're very much in the midst of today?
Yeah, I think you brought out some very important points. I mean, looking back, the Black Panthers got so much bad publicity and have often been kind of a pariah group, especially to the white mind, when in fact it's a really important part of the civil rights and liberation movements, the 1960s and before. And Oakland plays a very important role in this. Here again, we talk about innovation coming out of California. Well, there is this kind of spirit here. And so here was a very dynamic new center of activity springing out of the overall civil rights movement, which was centered in the South. But the North and the West play really important roles in civil rights and in the struggle for equality and liberation. So the Black Panthers captures that moment. And Oakland captures that too, because Oakland was a very important center of a Black Black culture and Black politics before the Black Panthers, going back to the sleeping car porters union and the settlement of Black people in West Oakland around the end of the where the Central Pacific Railroad ended up. Its yards and its main operations ended up in West Oakland, not in San Francisco, even though it was owned in San Francisco. And a lot of Black people fled San Francisco because of the late 19th century racism and joined the small group in Oakland. It was never a huge community, but it was a very dynamic one, out of which came people like C.K. Dellums and eventually his nephew, Ron Dellums, and so on, many great Black leaders. And the Black Panthers are part of that. And you're also right when you say police play a really important role in this. But the police are always like the front lines of white control of Black people and other working people and people of color. And they're the most visible and in a way the most directly oppressive for the people who are suffering this oppression. But it's in a larger context in which, as you said, disinvestment, politics, and segregation, everything we said about segregation, the politics of Oakland, they couldn't break through, even though their numbers had grown enormously in World War II. And after the war, with a huge migration to work in the shipyards, to work in industry out here, to seek a better life, and to get out of the South, where the Southern agrarian economy had collapsed. The old cotton economy had really collapsed in the 30s. So people moved west, mostly from Texas, East Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. And a lot of them ended up in the Bay Area. And of course, even more ended up in Los Angeles. So, and they created these really dynamic, thriving new communities. But the jobs started to disappear. The jobs started to move out to the suburbs. Industry, the dynamic industrial center of Oakland and Emeryville, Berkeley, started to close down. And of course, discrimination settled back into its normal course after having there been some important breakthroughs in World War II. And suddenly, huge numbers of Black people were jobless. And so conditions were worsened, the income fell, housing conditions, you couldn't afford a house, you couldn't buy a house, you were renting, these neighborhoods were doing worse and worse, more neglected. And then the white power structure of Oakland, as in all big cities, formed these urban renewal, urban redevelopment districts and programs, and started knocking down huge parts of the Black ghetto, putting freeways right through it. In West Oakland was cut in two ways by freeways. BART cut down the old commercial heart of West Oakland along 7th Street. They put in a huge postal package office. It's still there. And then they started tearing down housing for urban renewal, some of which was then rebuilt as public housing, but rather cheaply and badly in many cases, and more kind of ghettoization. And while not really renewing the economy of the area. So Black Panthers were responding to all that. They were responding to the decline of the economic conditions of Black community. They were responding to this political lock that white power structure still had on Oakland that they were trying to break through on, to the police violence, of course, to urban renewal and the destruction of much of their neighborhoods. And they were very politically aware of all this. Schools were declining, people were poor, so you had food programs, programs around the schools, programs around urban revival, and political programs, because ultimately, after the early stage of the Black Panthers, they turned to organizing Oakland, and they were instrumental in getting the first Black mayor of Oakland elected in 1976. So the image of Black Panthers is early on, it was about police and self-defense. And of course, it had a very masculine, masculinity plays a role as well as race, both on the police side and on the Huey Newton side of, gun-toting guys who are going to protect their communities. But over time, it morphed into many more service programs. And even in the early stage, led by Newton, it had a real kind of socialist program. They had a 10-point program for economic revival, what could be done for equality and fairness and economic development of the African-American community. So it's a very complex and sophisticated movement in many ways. It's been reduced to a cartoon by the combination of male posturing and arm, and brandishing guns, and then FBI counterintelligence programs that ended up killing a lot of Black Panther leaders around the country and stimulating a lot of response from the Panthers, some of which was very ill-conceived as armed response. But it's a really deep and important story. It's an Oakland story. It's a very much a California story that then spread nationwide in the same way as, say, and worldwide, in the same way as the gold rush did.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's the conceptual underpinnings of the 10-point plan of the agenda is incredibly complex. And I think absolutely West Oakland, as you discussed, there's forced segregation, right? A lack of access to housing, restrictive covenants and the like. But the population does swell incredibly beginning in World War II. And a lot of the early redevelopment projects, especially the Acorn Project, resulted in the loss of incredible housing and the displacement of thousands of people who are still largely hemmed in one way or another before East Oakland began opening up, and processes of blockbusting and the incremental expansion of West Oakland kicked in. But there is a moment where there's just, and the other thing, oftentimes the public housing is promised, but at best there's a big gap in time before that housing is even started, before the construction is even begun. But there is this moment where it's clear that there are just there's sort of the failure of New Deal liberalism. And as you say, in a everyday way, the main interaction with the state for a lot of folks is through the oppressive presence of the police in West Oakland.
Well, I want to strike a couple more positive notes too, which is that community in West Oakland was really something impressive. Just as the Black community and Oakland in general is this today. And Oakland has gotten a lot of bad press going back to the misuse of Gertrude Stein's quote, "There's no there," which actually referred to the fact that her childhood home had been torn down to make way for suburbs in the 1920s. And when she came back to visit from Paris, there was no there. It had nothing to do with a commentary on Oakland. In fact, she had thrived in Oakland. So Oakland gets bad press, mostly from San Francisco and in general. But here was this Black community that had an old core of professionals, an intellectual core, and the Black Panthers come out of that. They don't just come out of mass migration. They come out of that old core. And you'll see here in this picture, you're talking about Black students. And this is a moment when a lot of young Black people are going to college, finally. And this has always been a very important aspiration for Black people to get educated, to generate more professional and skilled jobs, and self-improvement in one sense, and entering the mainstream, but also developing your mind so that you can be a part of Black liberation in general. We have to remember that the Black Panthers actually starts with Huey Newton and one of the others, whose name, of course, conveniently escapes me now, joining forces at the original Merritt College, which was in West Oakland, and what had formerly been this university high school along what is now Martin Luther King Avenue under the BART tracks. It's still there. And it was original Merritt College. And the first African-American studies program, Black studies program, starts at Merritt College, the first one in America, the first one in the United States. And of course, spawns a whole movement of Black and ethnic studies programs, which becomes really powerful at San Francisco State and Berkeley, UC Berkeley in the 60s, leading to explosive confrontation. Comes back in the 80s with the attempts to expand the ethnic studies program at Berkeley, which, by the way, was the germ of the American culture program that our California class grew out of. And what you see here is a lot of the Panthers, if you look at the old photographs, a lot of them are students. You know, again, they're often portrayed as gun-toting ghetto dwellers or something. But a lot of them are young, aspiring student intellectuals and activists, and who grew out of that intellectual and college and community, school community in the west side of Oakland. And today, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, one of the most important antecedents of it was the protest about the murder of Horace Grant by BART police, Bay Area Rapid Transit Police, in Oakland. And those protests went on for quite a while, overlapping with some of the Occupy Wall Street protests in Oakland. And Oakland became, it had continued to be this very important working class, Black, brown, and Asian city, dynamic, diverse city, which in the 21st century got new injections of students, techies, gentrifiers, and this very volatile kind of a combination of peoples and energy, youthful energy. And when we talk about Black Lives Matter, youth really is the center of it. When we see with the movements of the 60s, a lot of these people in the civil rights movement, you know, it wasn't all, I mean, even Martin Luther King was young, for God's sake. He was shot down before he was 40. And so young people were really vital and central to the civil rights movement. They're central to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has a very important component in Oakland and antecedents in protests that have been going on in Oakland for the last decade, as Oakland has remained one of the most important centers of political activity and political innovation in the country, especially around the issues of overcoming white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, I didn't mean to downplay the vibrancy and power of the historical and more recent Black community in Oakland, simply to point out the destruction that was wrought by some of these governmental programs, which were, of course, mediated at the local scale through the redevelopment agency and all that. Well, I think your last notion, centering on Oakland and the East Bay, which we're both from to some extent, and the positivity, you know, the importance of youth. And again, these are young people, as you say, and it's gonna require young people as we move forward today. And I think that's a good place to end it if you do.
Yes, I think so. And, you know, us old guys can provide help in terms of perspective on history. You know, American culture is, as we know, pretty shallow when it comes to understanding history. And as Henry Ford so memorably said, history is bunk. And that's, you know, kind of American ideology. And it's very important for us as geographers, historians, and, you know, and older people to help the young understand history and its lessons, not forget the important positive lessons, as well as learning about things that were done wrong, things that were terrible. And, you know, you can see in our conversation, we're always trying to balance this. You know, because I think we're basically, you know, optimists of the spirit, as they say. If you're a progressive in America, you have to be. To be an intellectual in America, you have to be pretty optimistic because there's so much rejection of careful scholarship, careful argument, and so on for very simple formulaic thinking. And of course, it's the worst on the right, but we see it, you know, we see it on the left. And our job, and which a course like this is really important to, and this art exhibit is really important to, is to help young people think, because they want to learn. I've never seen young people who didn't want to learn, with very rare exceptions. They love learning. It feels tremendous when you start to discover the past, discover what came before you. And at the same time, the power of youth is that you're willing to say, wait a sec, this has been going on long enough, it's got to be changed. You know, so you're willing to question figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the New Deal, and, you know, and say enough's enough. We got to pull down statues, we got to pull down icons, and we have to do that in California too. They just took down the statues of Columbus, the ridiculous statues of Columbus in the state capitol and in front of Coit Tower. At the same time, we have to have a sense of history and argue it out and learn from those arguments. And at the same time that we take action. And that's not easy, whether you're young or you're old. And let's leave it on that note that the future is before us. Some very exciting things are happening in California today, and let's hope they keep happening.
Absolutely, and I appreciate, because you're implicitly discussing and talking about our role in the classroom at this particular moment, and it's never been more important in many ways, and it's never been more important for people like us to be very reflective and conscious of how we present ourselves in these ideas in terms of what can be learned, and stimulating the learning itself, and hopefully enabling people to move forward. So again, thanks so much to you, Dick, and Sherry and Dave as well for putting this together. And again, it's been a huge pleasure and a privilege to be involved with the exhibit and this conversation in particular. So
thank you too, Seth, for organizing this.
Yeah.